Hey guys, my name is Greg McLean. I work out of a gym, Premier Fitness Systems in North Scottsdale, and today I want to talk about sleep. Just through my personal journey with issues with sleep and fatigue over the last 15 years, something that's definitely become a passion of mine. And I think looking back, something where I had issues, my entire life. Tended to go to bed 1, 2 in the morning in high school. I guess I felt like at that time I didn't need more sleep, and I was able to get away with it. And I think one of the biggest things I see with teenage athletes or 20-year-old athletes is oftentimes there's signs there that there's something wrong and sleep isn't necessarily good. And when it comes to how important it is, I think a lot of people tend to wait till it gets really bad before they take action. I think oftentimes that's because people don't know what to do, who to turn to, or, thoughts of wearing a CPAP or going to see a sleep doc is like, no. And I just feel like there's a lot of different options and a lot of low-hanging fruit that I think a lot of people don't necessarily kind of know what or how to try. To start to basically just kind of chip away at sleeping better. Even the first slide here, I think, that's the most important thing, especially as we get older. Like all the research I've done on sleep, when you look at it affecting every aspect of our health and how everything from hormones to just mental clarity, skill acquisition, recovery, like everything comes back to sleep. And it's one thing that people sleep well, but oftentimes I think many people have some sort of issues around sleep, whether they're not getting enough or, caffeine too late in the day, alcohol, and, all these things are starting to rob them of their sleep. And, for most people when they're younger, you can get away with everything, but it's still not a good long-term strategy. When we think about everyone that's got Alzheimer's and dementia and cancer in their 60s nowadays, the important thing is to take action at a younger age and not wait till things get so bad that, at that point, people have to take action, which is typically how it goes. So, the picture here, I often think of like the beginning sleep issues with people tends to look like think of like a hose outside. Let's just say the hose is outside and there's a small leak. You realize there's something wrong with the seal, but it's kind of outside. It's far away from the house, and there's just a little bit of drip. Every time you go out to the hose, you can see that like there's some condensation there, but it's not flooding your backyard. This is what I would kind of call the beginning stages of issues when it comes to sleep. I feel like people know that there's something wrong, but it's nothing crazy. And as a result, oftentimes action is not taken. It's just kind of people are aware. And then I would say, think of this picture almost like your sink in the kitchen. If you were to go put the trash can underneath the sink and you're to look down and you saw like the wood underneath your sink, just wet or a drip coming out of the faucet, pretty sure most people would start to possibly take action. And this is kind of what I think tends to happen later on when sleep issues are left kind of untreated, and that people start to worry. The issue is, how long does it take to go from the outside, basically sink, to the inside when it comes to leaking or water condensation? Because for some people that might be 5, 10, even 20 years before things get bad enough. But how much long-term health has been lost in the process as a result of that? When we think about like our bank account, right? Like if we saw, in the matter of a few days, we hadn't checked our bank account, and then all of a sudden we had fraud. We had all these little charges for $1.26 from all these unknown places. If someone started stealing few bucks a day from our account, pretty sure most people would get on the phone and make sure that was resolved immediately. Whereas when it comes to our sleep, like, how come that's not the case? And, thinking back to myself when I was younger and how important this is, I think that's really important, because understanding as I've gotten older how much it plays into all of our long-term health and, what tends to happen, a result of years and years of not taking action. And those are things that tend to build up in the body that we can't go back and undo. So oftentimes some of this stuff that started out as a small leak has now turned into some type of chronic situation in our body, type 2 diabetes, or maybe our hormones, or maybe someone's trying to get pregnant, but they can't. I mean, these are all little things that start to occur as a result of sleep being kind of untreated for years, yet most people don't take action. So the first thing I want to talk about today was like devices. So for me, for years, I've got my Garmin on here, but I got my Oura Ring upstairs. I've also got a Whoop. I think the first thing is just becoming aware. Obviously, if you're not tracking it, you have no clue. And, when it comes to the 3 devices, they're obviously not accurate like a PolySom, which is the device they use in the lab to look at sleep. But at least it's good to give you kind of a relative idea compared to itself, like how you're sleeping night to night. So I think that's step one. If people realize there's issues with sleep, like, how long are you sleeping for? Because, if you're in bed for 8 hours, but it takes you an hour to fall asleep, and, you're waking up 4 times a night to go to the bathroom, or if it takes you hours to lay in bed before you fall asleep, all of a sudden you're like, well, I was in bed for 8 hours, but I only slept for 5. Or let's just say half your time in bed is spent at lower levels of sleep. We're not getting the deep and REM sleep that our body needs in order to flourish and just stay healthy. And so, for me, before I had jaw surgery, I had used the CPAP. And, one of the things I realized, like, sometimes on like a Whoop, I would have like a 93 recovery. And like during allergy season, I might see that on my CPAP, I had like 7 events an hour, and I wake up the next day and like, regardless of the Whoop said, like, I know from having 7 events an hour on a CPAP, like my sleep wasn't good and my recovery sure as hell wasn't 94%. So, taking what those devices tell us with a grain of salt, I think it's more so, it's like using the same scale every day. It might not be exact, but it's going to give you a relative idea, and now you have something to start to look at. But I think taking a look at how long you're in bed every night, how long you're actually sleeping, and then as I have on here, you're basically, a lot of these devices will show you your lower levels of sleep, and then your deep and your REM sleep. So optimally, we want to get like 8 hours of sleep, and if you think from a percentage standpoint, I want to get about 22 to 24% of my total sleep should come from deep sleep, and then 20% from REM sleep. So that's really important to just start to look at those numbers just to try to get a baseline, because then I think as you start to adjust different things in your schedule, whether it's supplements or stop drinking before bed or cut caffeine out earlier in the day, you have a way to start to see like, how are these things affecting my sleep in a good or bad way. Kind of side note, during COVID, a bunch of PGA golfers were all given Whoops for a year. And it was interesting to hear guys that didn't have them and they started wearing them. And just like different stuff that they became aware of them was pretty interesting. Even guys saying like, if I had a glass of wine before bed, I was fine. But if I had a second glass, like, how much that robbed them of, let's say, their REM sleep, and like it was noticeable. Or, guys would have a few drinks and then they were up 4 or 5 times, or the disturbances that are normally like 5 to 10 were 17 for the night. But it was good just from a behavior standpoint for people to start to have an idea of kind of what was going on with their body relative to their sleep. first and foremost, regardless of what device you choose, based on the technology, I think the Oura Ring probably the best based on the green light technology for actually looking at sleep. But then I feel like the Oura Ring for lifting wasn't very functional. So that's where like the Garmin or the Whoop was good. So kind of depending on what works for you budget wise. I know the Fitbit does it as well. Just having something to kind of track your sleep. The good old fuck around method. I saw this about a year ago on Instagram and really liked it because I think with sleep, I think a lot of times people are like, oh man, I don't sleep well. I don't want to go see a sleep doctor. I'm not going to wear a CPAP. Like people always go to like the worst case scenario when it comes to sleep rather than like, okay, like what are some small changes and how can I start to mess around with little things, like melatonin before bed or, no blue light 2 hours before you go to bed. Maybe you're reading instead, or maybe I'm going to take a bath, a few hours before bed or meditate. And starting to bring these things into your life and actually see how it affects your sleep. Because I think that is huge as far as, people recognizing that it doesn't take crazy stuff sometimes to have some big impact on your sleep. And that's why I wanted to do this podcast today, just talking about some of the low-hanging fruit. Now I'm going to get into some of the more complex stuff related to that just to give a little bit of information and background. But for most people, just starting with the low-hanging fruit, I think is huge for helping someone sleep better. So what I've got a picture here is basically, two different skeletons. The one on the left is someone with a well-pronounced jaw, nice horseshoe-shaped. And then number two is someone with basically a thinner face, someone that's going to have like a high arched palate. And one of the biggest things I want to talk about today is airway. Because that's one of the most important things when it comes to sleep. So if you look at the two pictures, 1,000 years ago, all of our ancestors had wide arches. And basically when you look at like the arch, okay, as my arch gets wider, what happens is my nasal cavity gets bigger. And so why that's so important is, about 200 years ago, Industrial Revolution, we started making foods that were a lot softer. We didn't have to chew like we did. The quality of our food went down as a result. So we stopped strengthening our tongues and jaw muscles like we once did from having to chew significantly in our day. What that did was it weakened our tongue. And our tongue, as we're developing as children, isn't doing what it once did as far as ensuring that I'm pushing on the roof of the mouth and making sure that the lower jaw doesn't fall down, that I keep pushing up into that jaw so that my face grows up and out, which is going to leave me with a wide arch so that my tongue can fit in by the time I'm an adult. So this is kind of what led me into all this stuff with my own situation is, I wasn't breastfed as a kid. I had food allergies related to formula. And then as a result, I had swollen tonsils, adenoids as a young kid. And I became a mouth breather at a young age, and I never switched back. So by the time I learned all this stuff at 40, I realized that I had the upper jaw of a 4-year-old, which means I had the nose of a 4-year-old. So no shit, my tongue didn't fit in my mouth. It's one of those things though that if my tongue can't fit in the mouth properly, I don't get a vacuum type effect to where I can breathe really well through my nose. And if I've got a small jaw and I've got a small nose, it makes it really hard for me to nose breathe when everything gets relaxed when I get into deeper levels of sleep. So what ends up happening oftentimes for a lot of people with sleep issues is everything relaxes as they get into deep sleep. And then as a result, they have a hard time breathing, and this is where people will either stop breathing completely or partially stop breathing, and then sensors go off and the body basically gets kicked out of like a deep level of sleep and goes to a lower level of sleep. So if that's happening all night long, we end up waking up, and yeah, we spend 8 hours in bed, but the quality of our sleep sucks, because it's kind of like every time you get into deep, restful sleep, it's like someone's waking you up. And they're like, hey, go back to lower level of sleep. And then when you get back here again, I'm going to wake you up. It's kind of like torture. So, obviously this is something where progression tends to happen when it comes to sleep apnea. And a lot of it comes back to our ability to breathe and a full-size airway, which most people nowadays do not have. It's just a matter of how bad is it on a spectrum. So kind of talking about like what I had said, if you look at, for instance, back in the day, we would keep the tongue to the roof of the mouth here, and then what that would do is force the jaw as we grow forward and hold it up. So when the tongue sits on the roof of the mouth, it basically locks the lower jaw up with the upper jaw, and then it makes sure it provides like scaffolding so the airway grows out this way. This is why all of our ancestors had big bone structure, big noses. They had well-pronounced cheek jawlines. Whereas nowadays, our airways are getting smaller and smaller due to our tongue not pushing our jaw forward and up as we develop. That makes it harder and harder. So let's just say, for instance, I've got decent development, but then maybe I have a milk allergy. So now my tonsils and adenoids are swollen when I'm 7 every time I have milk, and I don't really tell my parents about it. And then all of a sudden I start mouth breathing. So it's something where it's like switching software from like optimal software being like, I'm going to nose breathe all the time, except for when I'm eating. I want my mouth closed. And the non-optimal is I start mouth breathing because let's just say my allergies are bad, or my tonsils or my adenoids get swollen, and it's hard for me to breathe through my nose because my nose is already smaller than it was 1,000 years ago. And then, before you know it, someone goes from nose breathing to mouth breathing, and they go back and forth until it just gets easier for someone to like just stay a mouth breather. And then the minute we're mouth breathing all day long, we're not really pushing our jaw forward and up. So as a result, we're left as adults with these airways that are the size of a child's. And this is where we're left doing jaw surgery, braces, expanders, or using a CPAP. And I think people don't understand why. And it's crazy because there were guys 100 years ago that were expanding kids at 5, 6 years old to make sure that there was just enough space for their tongue to fit and to ensure that their basically nose was going to be adequate size by the time they were adult, to ensure these kids weren't having sleep issues. So it's something that's been around for a very long time. I think after World War II, something where the money side of dentistry and how things were looked at changed. And, we're now left with society where basically maybe 20% of people have some kind of sleep disorder breathing, and it's only getting worse because our jaws and airways are getting smaller. And this is going to continue to happen due to not having to chew all the time. And this is where kind of different tools and devices can be used to basically go back and recapture what we've lost, to ensure that, after we get out of our 30s, that we can still live a healthy life and have a good airway versus, I've got to sleep with a CPAP for the rest of my life. And even if I'm using a CPAP 8 hours a day, what about the other 16 hours a day that I don't get enough air to my body, and it's affecting my health big time by the time I'm 50? And then couple that with stress, and this is kind of what's happened to our society. So really important just to kind of understand the mechanics of the airway and jaw, and kind of, I think, why there are so many issues nowadays with people sleeping. So I had gotten some basically some people to kind of fill out a survey, just kind of stuff that they wanted to see. So I wanted to talk about the different stages of sleep. So basically we have like our lower level stages of sleep. So we have a stage 1, 2, 3, 4, which is a non-REM sleep. And then we have REM sleep. So typically we fall asleep. We'll stay in stage 1, 2. Those are our lower levels of sleep. And then every 90 minutes or so, we'll tend to go into stage 3, 4, which is going to give me some deep restorative sleep. And then about the 70-minute mark, we'll jump back down to stage 2, and then we'll go into REM. So oftentimes the way they look at sleep in a lab is that basically they'll run it in, they'll look at every 30-second interval, and then they look at like 90-minute windows when they look at architecture of sleep to kind of understand how efficient someone is and what's going on in their body. But kind of what I was talking about, someone that's got a sleep apnea or a UARS, which is upper airway respiratory syndrome, people either stop breathing completely or they have a hard time breathing all night long, and it's very hard labored breathing. And this is oftentimes where people will get into some of these deeper stages of sleep, and then basically the body is either woken up because they stop breathing, or something where a sensor in the nose will go off because the brain waves get woken up because there's not enough oxygen, and then we get kicked down into these lower levels of sleep. So the value of our sleep is the stage 3, 4, and then the REM sleep. That's what we're trying to achieve as far as optimally every night, get as much time in there as we can. But when we have sleep issues, we tend to have a hard time falling asleep, or basically we spend a lot of time in bed, but the quality of the sleep from a percentage perspective doesn't look that good because, typically we have issues with stopping breathing, or we have oxygen levels dropping in our sleep, and then as a result, we don't wake up refreshed. Okay, so I want to talk about Dr. Stephen Park. This is an awesome book for people just kind of looking to learn a little bit more about sleep. For today, I wanted to just kind of break down some of the low-level stuff and really talk about it. But, one of the most important things he talks about, I think this is a great concept as well for athletes, is the threshold concept. I think of like our body almost like you've got 1,000 levers on the wall, and they're all ranked 1 to 5. And you've got hormones, and you've got stress levels, and you've got, you name it, all those dials are always constantly at different numbers. And at some point, we're on a cliff and we're okay until we're not okay and we're falling off that cliff. We tend to see this with athletes that, it's something where it's like, well, I don't know. I've never had problems with my back or my shoulder until today. And then it like turns into a chronic problem. And, oftentimes what he talks about here is that, our bodies are super complex. And I think it's kind of like with hormones and stress and sleep and work, all these different things play into account. Are we over-exercised? Is it something, do we need a vacation? But like our body is always sitting with all these levers at different places. And there becomes a breaking point or a perfect storm when it comes to all this stuff. And, realizing that we're okay until we're not okay. And then it becomes this whole, when we realize we're not okay, can we figure out how to get things back so the not okay doesn't turn into a chronic thing, which, we're dealing with for years, and then all of a sudden that's turning into something else from a spiderweb perspective and something where we can't get our health back on track. So like one of the most important things when it comes to our body is circadian rhythm. I don't know if a lot of guys follow like an Andrew Huberman, but he talks a lot about this, just about kind of light early in the day, kind of getting the body up and moving, kind of setting the clock in the brain. But I read an interesting article here basically in the New York Times, it talks literally about like 50% of all of our hormones have these internal clocks. And especially when we're younger, high school, in our 20s, I think one of the biggest issues is, we've got our normal school schedule, or we work from 9 to 5 every single day, and then the weekend hits. And, the term social jet lag I really like, because it's like to the break of dawn, the minute the weekend hits, I'm going to caffeine up, I'm going out drinking, my sleep is off because I'm going to bed at 2 a.m. I wake up hungover the next day, I'm taking a nap, and then all of a sudden it's kind of like Monday hits, and it's like we got to get everything back on track. And I think as we start to age, it gets harder and harder to do so, and then people either continue to kind of bang their head against the wall, and this is where they have issues starting to happen with their health, or people start to make some changes in regard to their health, and I think that's really important. So here we go, Dr. Huberman. He's got basically a neuro lab out of Stanford. Love his work, just really good insight on a lot of things. And, one of the most important things he talks about is, from the sleep perspective, is, especially in the first 3 hours of the day, starting to basically get some natural light exposure. It's one of the best things to kind of set that internal clock in our brain and ensure that, that clock is optimally running from a health perspective. Another thing he talks about is, limiting the bright artificial light late at night to ensure that we basically aren't hijacking melatonin or different stuff when it comes to our sleep. In that last article I was talking about in New York Times, it was really interesting. They talked about just how sensitive like the sensors in our eyelids are, as far as just like even looking at cancer patients in a hospital, and how they did some different studies about literally putting like black tape over all the lights and the noises. And it was crazy to see how much better people slept. So I think, the one thing I think outside of getting light early in the day to ensure we set the circadian rhythm is, as much as I've read about, sleeping with some type of blackout shades or mask when we sleep is huge. Especially if you've got a room where it's like sun's up at 5, it's coming through your curtains and you're not up till 7. It's like stuff like that can have a detrimental effect on just kind of waking the body, not fully, but kicking you into a lower level of sleep, and then kind of robbing you your last few hours, or just having like blinking lights or falling asleep with the TV on. Like all those things matter. You look at all the studies and the data, and it's crazy how just that one thing could be so critical in as far as helping people sleep better. Good old naps. So I've listened to a lot of stuff, Matthew Walker podcast on Joe Rogan, Peter Attia, and from all the studies and books I've read on sleep, the biggest thing he talks about is basically when it comes to naps, if you have issues sleeping at night, it's kind of a matter of basically not necessarily napping unless you have to. But a few of his rules are even don't nap for more than 90 minutes, don't nap after 4 p.m., because all this is basically kind of stealing some of the chemicals in our body that build up the sleepiness in our bodies and allow us to fall asleep and sleep well when it's time to actually go to bed. So that's huge as far as kind of when it comes to naps. Another thing he talks about is just making sure, like, besides sex and sleeping, if you have issues with sleep, is kind of not being in your bedroom until it's time to go to bed. All you're doing is kind of basically training the behavior of the brain to kind of help know that, like, hey, when I'm in my bed, it's time to sleep, and when I'm not. But for people that have issues, it's all these little things that, just have effects on our body and just spatial awareness and what we think to help give us a better chance at success when it comes to all this. All right, negative effects on your health. So when it comes to sleep, like I said in the beginning, like sleep affects everything. Leptin and ghrelin there. So those are hormones in our body that basically create hunger and then also the ability to feel full. And so I'm sure, as you guessed, like people that have issues with sleep, you know, they tend to basically binge on sugar. They tend to overeat and try to get energy from foods that they tend to not get from their sleep. I think this is also where people that oftentimes have some type of sleep problems, you know, often will have issues with like a insulin response, type 2 diabetes. And a lot of this just has to do with like our hormones being affected and they're downregulated because we're not getting what we want from sleep. And as a result, like our body is smart and it's going to look for different ways to go get the energy we need. And as a result of doing that, we're often choosing foods that are high in sugar or caffeine, which only lead us to more crashes, issues with insulin, and then issues falling asleep at nighttime. You know, some of the other things that I said were, you know, really affects the hormones. And when it comes to like weight loss, cardiovascular disease, all these things, there is insane amounts of studies, especially as it comes to, you know, people have basically issues with sleeping. What ends up happening when we sleep, we get nitric oxide, which is basically taken in through our nose, and we bring this down in through the lungs. And this is like our natural, basically, blood pressure medication. So when we have issues either breathing through the nose or just breathing well throughout the night, what tends to happen is we don't get our blood pressure medication that helps calm and regulate and reset our nervous system. So then we have an inflamed body that's basically got a sympathetically driven nervous system because we don't recover from the day before, and then take that building day after day after day. And before you know it, we have this chronically sympathetic nervous system that we can't get to calm down. And then as a result, we're more sensitive to light, stimuli, stress. And then it's like creates a cycle that we can't get out of. And then it's kind of like when people get older, they're like, well, I don't understand. And you're like, well, all these things have been present along the way. People just typically tend not to see them for what they are. And then I think all it takes is someone sitting down and asking some good questions. But, you know, people start to understand, like, holy shit, like all this stuff really has a big effect on my health. And especially for those with weight loss, you know, I think sometimes, you know, people, especially with OSA, they'll have pockets of fat in their throat, which prevents them from breathing so well, kind of basically helps kind of fill the airway with space, leaving less room for the tongue, which makes it harder to pass air. So then it's like this cycle where it's like, well, our throats get fat deposits in them. It's harder to breathe. So then as a result, I don't sleep as well. I wake up, I'm using donuts and candy and caffeine to get through my day. And it becomes this vicious cycle that oftentimes can kind of be nipped in the butt earlier on, or at least kind of approached differently with possibly kind of having some success before things get out of control. All right, guys, so I want to talk about the two types of sleep apnea just as it relates, because for me, I've always been like thin, lean, fast metabolism. And one of the things that I've kind of dealt with when I went through all this stuff is, you know, in the past, like sleep apnea, OSA, has typically been like the 60-year-old on the couch with 50 pounds overweight and they're snoring logs. So with OSA, what tends to happen from a perspective of health is these people either start to have apneas or hypopneas, which means they either stop breathing completely or they have like a 30 to 50% decrease for more than 10 seconds as it relates to if you're to get tested. The third thing tends to be like desaturation. So the oxygen levels will drop more than 2 or 3%, which will basically kind of put the body in motion with some of the stuff we've talked about today. The other sleep apnea I want to talk about today is UARS. So this is something I learned a lot about because I had 2 at-home tests and then 1 in a lab. And I realized that most people don't understand UARS. So for all your young, leaner, thin, fit people, this tends to be the new modern day sleep apnea. The issue with testing for it is there's a lot of different basically theories as to what it is. And for many years, all they did was test for OSA. So when it comes to UARS, I ended up catching in a podcast with Dr. Stephen Park, doctor in New York, after I had been tested, used a CPAP, had no results. And then I ended up going and getting tested in this lab in New York City. And what I found was that, there's only a few places I would say that are good at testing UARS, which means many people will get tested that have UARS, but they'll be compared to OSA standards. And most people with UARS don't stop breathing partially or fully for more than 10 seconds, and they don't desat when it comes to their oxygen. So these people tend to always show up as fine or mild sleep apnea. But the issue with UARS is these people tend to have high labored breathing all night long. And it's like that the whole night when you sleep. So you don't actually stop breathing, but your body works really hard. And then what ends up happening is there's signals in the brains that shift the brainwave activity if you have this type of apnea. And then what ends up happening is these people go from deep levels of sleep to basically lower levels of sleep, and that happens all night long. But when you talk about like skinny people that have bad insomnia, anxiety, depression, all these types of things, I have read probably 100 medical journal articles, but a lot of that ADHD, asthma, all these breathing issues, especially people that are pretty skinny or lean, that all comes back to this type of sleep apnea, which after I found the doctor in New York, I Googled the top 10 Yelp rated sleep docs in Arizona, and I had sent them my doctor's criteria for testing in a lab, and I couldn't find one person that tests like him in Arizona. And the reason I was reaching out is because I wanted to find doctors that I could send people to. So it was something where it was like, okay. So, for those that basically deal with fatigue, sleepiness, yet they tend not to be overweight and they're pretty active, like this is a sleep apnea up until probably about 2 years ago I'd never even heard of. And this is where I've spent a ton of time researching, because I think modern day, so many people have this chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, all your Crohn's, IBS. You look at this body type and then the tens of symptoms that you tend to have with UARS, and it's crazy to see kind of what people have. So all right guys, so the one video I want to show today is just kind of showing people what sleep apnea is, just so people kind of have an idea and kind of can go from there.
Obstructive sleep apnea occurs when the upper airways collapse, resulting in holding of the breath during sleep. After a period of time, the sleeper partially wakes up, gasping for air. This cycle of breath holding followed by gasping can occur many times an hour during sleep. In addressing obstructive sleep apnea, 2 factors need to be considered. The first is airway size, and the second is the amount of air that we habitually breathe. In relation to airway size, the narrower the upper airway, the greater the negative pressure as air is drawn into the lungs. Habitual mouth breathing during childhood can alter the shape of the face, resulting in small or receding jaws. This reduces airway size and increases the risk of lifelong sleep apnea. As we get older, loss of muscle tone in the upper airway also contributes to holding of the breath during sleep. To help open the upper airway, it is important not to sleep on the back and also to breathe through the nose. The second consideration in obstructive sleep apnea is the amount of air that we breathe. It is very common for people to habitually breathe too much air, as indicated by audible breathing, often through the mouth. Heavy breathing during sleep increases negative pressure in the upper airways, causing collapse. Imagine inhaling a large volume of air through a collapsible paper straw. The heavier one breathes, the greater the likelihood of the walls of the straw collapsing inwards. On the other hand, breathing light through the straw causes less negative pressure, thereby reducing the risk of collapsing the walls. Breathing re-education to reset the breathing center in the brain to a lighter breathing volume significantly reduces the occurrence of obstructive sleep apnea. Combining this with myofunctional therapy to strengthen the upper airways enhances the benefits, resulting in a significant reduction in apneas and hypopneas.
So the two things I want to talk about here, one being, the size of the jaw and the airway really help kind of create a pump. So when the tongue rests on the roof of the mouth, we pressurize the cheeks, and it's like when my tongue pushes on the roof of my mouth and I go to push on the roof of my mouth, it creates this vacuum, really allows me to pull air in very efficiently with my nose. So part of the reason why that's so important is the size of your jaw is going to dictate how strong your pump is as far as your ability to pull air in. I think the second thing I've learned a lot about, there's a famous dentist in Australia, Dr. Stephen Lin, and what he talks about is just the nutrients in our food are not what they used to be. So if you think of like two straws, like back in the day, like our nutrients in our foods were a lot better. So the building materials for everything in our body were solid. So if you think of like a straw for like a Yeti cup and how solid that is, a lot of our basically airway in our tubes used to be made of solid material. And then you think of like where it said there, like a wet straw. So think of like a paper straw that gets a little bit wet. Modern day, like most of us are left with basically materials that built our body that are not what they once were. So as a result, we have to compensate because we can't move air due to the quality of our pipes, if that makes sense. And so all these are little things that are being taken, a little bit here, a little bit there, but it adds up and creates this perfect storm where a lot of people, once they get into their 30s or 40s, have issues with sleeping and breathing well, and it's scary for people because I think it has a dramatic impact on their health and they don't know what to do. So I saw this, I really like this. But for people that want to go see a doctor, I think the important thing is kind of understanding like what to do. Like I said, I think a lot of issues stem from our jaws and our airway, but what I've learned through this whole process is there's not a ton of doctors that really know this stuff the way I've taught myself, just due to them seeing patient after patient and doing things a certain way for a long time. And it's been fascinating for me to see like some of these even airway centric dentists and how they're helping adults basically go back and expand their jaws with retainers or different stuff that can help kind of get back what's lost so that we can spend that second half of our lives staying healthy. But, when it comes to sleep issues, one of the most important things I would always say is for people to start with the nose. If you've ever broken your nose or possibly broke it, or you have a hard time breathing in your nose, there's everything from, you could have swollen tonsils, adenoids, polyps, really bad allergies. All these things factor in your ability to breathe through your nose, and it doesn't matter if your tongue fits in the roof of your mouth. It's like if you have a hard time breathing through your nose, you're going to mouth breathe, and that's going to dramatically affect your sleep. So I would always tell people to start there. The next step I would say would be to go in a lab and get tested. Like I said, OSA, real simple as far as like most sleep doctors have that down as far as how to test for it, titrate, and kind of let someone know where they fall in the spectrum. For those that have the UARS or think they might have that, I would tell you the at-home does not do justice like it does for someone with OSA. But finding a lab that actually uses basically nasal transducers when you go in the lab is the one thing I've learned that's really important for someone that has UARS. Because what I learned from my doctor is OSA tends to be people that loud snore, but oftentimes we could be skinny and snore. It's just not audible at a frequency that you can hear. So that doesn't mean we're not snoring. It just means you might not just be able to hear it. So this is where getting the right sleep doctor, and then based on what the ENT and the sleep doctors say, would possibly, if there's an issue, if it's something where you don't want to wear a CPAP and you want like healthier options, there's so many things now like mandibular advancement where it pulls the lower jaw forward, kind of opens up the airway versus using a CPAP. There's retainers that you just put on your mouth and it basically expands your jaw over the course of a few years, which I used as well. And then there's different surgical stuff. But I think sometimes people think, oh, I don't want to wear a mask for the rest of my life. But these people are 30 and it's like, if you're not going to breathe well for the rest of your life, how are you going to sleep and how are you going to get through your day? And that was part of the reason why I wanted to kind of do this podcast. The sleep hijackers. So when it comes to this stuff, like I would say there's a number of things. I think a lot of people are aware from a caffeine standpoint. The half-life of caffeine is 6 hours and the quarter life is 12 hours. So that means if you drink caffeine at noon, you still have a quarter of it in your body at midnight when you're sleeping. And so, caffeine can have a dramatic effect on robbing your REM sleep. So I think a lot of times when people have issues with falling asleep, if they have insomnia, this can be like first and foremost something to really start to pay attention to is like not having caffeine maybe after 10 in the morning to see if it starts to help with sleep. Good old weed. Always laugh about this because Joe Rogan did a few podcasts with Matthew Walker, and he must have asked Matt about 17 times, like, are you sure weed isn't good for my sleep? The one thing they found with weed is that it tends to help people fall asleep quicker, just like alcohol, but it tends to rob people of about 20% of their REM sleep. So that is huge. So yeah, although you're falling asleep quicker, that doesn't mean that the quality of your sleep architecture over the course of the 8 hours is that of someone that didn't smoke. So that's really important. When it came to CBD, I think there's just not enough studies to tell. So it's something where, I've talked to a few doctors about it. They said, at this point, there's not a ton of negative research. So it's kind of one of those things where I guess we never know. But, if it's something where people have success with, the known negative side effects like alcohol, weed, and caffeine are not there currently. But, I would say do your own research. And then alcohol, one of the worst things about alcohol is that it raises body temperature. So, for most of us, we need to drop our body temperature by 2 to 3 degrees to help our bodies kind of fall asleep. And this is one of the issues with booze, especially people that drink to help themselves fall asleep. One, it basically prevents people from getting as good a REM sleep. But you look at all the studies, a lot of people are, although they fall asleep quickly compared to someone that has maybe insomnia, it's like, yeah, I understand why people use it, but the actual data says that it's probably not in your best interest. Screen time before bed. Matthew Walker did a 3 podcast series on Dr. Peter Attia's podcast. It was really interesting, all the different studies that I kind of went and looked up relative to this, but just people being put, in places where there was no technology, or basically out in the woods or cabins where, people didn't have access to all the technology, and, how crazy it was as far as, oftentimes blue light can like hijack our melatonin and basically dump it later on in the night, which makes it harder for us to fall asleep. And then our level of sleepiness isn't there. So screen time can be one of the most dramatic things, especially for kids nowadays. And I think the majority of kids are sleeping an hour or two less a day than they used to. And, one of the biggest things, especially teenagers, college kids, is, people waking up. Like, the studies are crazy how, like, just basically people have anxiety first thing in the morning, or they're waking up throughout the night. They're checking their DMs or their texts because they're afraid they're going to miss out. And all these things have a dramatic impact on our sleep. So for us to be aware of that and do what we can, if we're ready to take those steps, I think it's really important. I would say like insomnia is probably one of the biggest things I had people asking me questions about. And I think from all the research I've read about like anxiety, depression, just sympathetically hijacked nervous systems, I think a lot like goes back to me thinking about people that basically like don't necessarily stop breathing, but they have a hard time breathing all night long. People with UARS, one of the common side effects for people with UARS is insomnia. And I'm not saying everyone has it, but I think a contributing factor tends to be our nervous systems don't ever fully relax throughout the night. And so we have these chronically hijacked nervous systems. And then if we're not sleeping as good and we're taking caffeine, all of a sudden we're in these cycles and people can't get out of them. And I think one of the hard things is you go see a sleep doctor because it's not OSA. Like, these people get tested or they do an at-home test and they're like, oh, you're fine. It's like, dude, they're not fine. And then people are like, well, shit, I've tried everything. Like, why isn't this working? So I think this is one, like caffeine levels, making sure you get tested by the right doctor to see if that's something you have, UARS, and just kind of like literally ticking off all these things to make sure you're good. Yeah, so this is one of the most important slides I'd say on here as it relates, especially to older people. So what we have these glial cells in our brain. They make up about 90% of our brain, and they help to like prune and clean our brain. So only when we get into deep sleep do our neurons basically like almost like shrink up. And then what happens is these alleyways are created. These glial cells are like Pac-Mans, and they go in and they're pulling basically plaque off of our brain, and they're pruning dead neurons. And their job is to go in and basically clean up our brain every night to set ourselves up for success the next day. And one of the biggest things for older people is they don't get as much deep sleep as they age. But if you have sleep problems your whole life, or you're only sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night, I mean, these are things that age your brain by 20, 30 years by the time you're like 30 or 40. I think back to just hearing a podcast, someone talking about Ronald Reagan. He was kind of like, yeah, I'll sleep when I'm dead. And, here's a guy that was notorious for only sleeping 5 or 6 hours a night. And then he goes and gets Alzheimer's. And, I think like a Matthew Walker's funny, like the amount of people that can get away with 6 hours of sleep and be okay is zero. So, most people think they defy that, but they do not. So the next thing I want to talk about is allergies. I think it's really important, especially if you have bad seasonal allergies, using stuff like a neti pot, nasal strips, making sure you get allergy tested. But, here's me. I did allergy shots, and then here's my CPAP saying that the minute it was allergy season, here I am breathing out of a machine. I would use a neti pot before bed, allergy shots. And here I am having 7 events an hour when I normally had less than 1 the minute allergy season hit. And I'm doing everything I can, and it doesn't even matter. I'm using a machine, and it still can't help me. So, to those that have bad allergies, good luck. Because, yeah, you're probably going to mouth breathe. And then you're going to feel like shit during allergy season. And it's like, good luck with that. I think another big one is dairy. There's a number of articles out there, especially for myself. I feel like I don't really eat dairy, maybe pizza every once in a while, but, typically what can happen is, drinking milk is just inflames basically tonsils, adenoids, and then what ends up happening is it makes it harder for people to breathe. So whether it's seasonal allergies or like food allergies, this could be huge as far as affecting, if stuff in the back of our throat is swollen, making it hard to breathe. So make sure you get that checked. Sleeping pills. That's kind of one of the funniest things. Matthew Walker's book, I think it was the chapter on sleeping pills, basically the only chapter. He said he paid an attorney to look into just talking about all the different sleep drugs. And, the biggest thing I walked away from is that if I hit you with a baseball bat in the head, you're going to get knocked out. Technically, you're out, but are you really sleeping? And this is what he talks about basically with sleeping pills. For a lot of people, PTSD, all kinds of different stuff. I think they think they're sleeping, but when you look at a lot of the research as it relates to sleeping pills, it is not good. And, he talked about a study that they did for one of the major sleeping pill companies, and it basically said by taking the sleeping pills that these monkeys were unlearning 50% of what they learned for the day compared to someone that was sleeping without the pills. And, we talk about just basically long-term brain health and our body actually getting deep restorative sleep that we need. And there's a difference between being knocked out or being put out versus actually sleeping well, and what the data would say if you slept in a lab as far as the quality of your sleep. So do your own homework on this, but I think that's really important, especially for someone that relies on this, is that I think reading about it might get some of you to kind of take some different action. Next slide. I want to talk about just basically, this is most people. When I talk about sleep issues, they're like, shit, I'm not wearing a Darth Vader mask to bed. There's no freaking way. But it's crazy because I know a lot of people that have worn them 5-10 years, and it kind of definitely helps. And then, I look at myself and I was like, well, what about the other 16 hours a day? And, I started researching, and there's so much stuff out there. There's so much technology and different treatments that you can have done to your nose, retainers, surgery. I think it's something where if you can't breathe well at 20 or sleep well at 20 and you have a hard time breathing, really taking a deep dive into some of your options rather than just kind of waiting, because I think this is serious for people's health. As it relates to different stuff, I think, I've got a picture of the chili pad in the top corner. I think these are some of the easy things that we can do to kind of just help set ourselves up for sleep. But, cooling the body temperature, I basically got blue light glasses, just blocking out the blue light. Breathe the right strips. It's just kind of helping hold open the nose for better or easier breathing as we sleep. Some type of sleepy time tea, just to kind of help us relax. Neti pot to kind of clear our noses. Earplugs, nose mask or face mask, just to help us kind of block out all the stimulus, let our brain quiet down. And then, I think breath work and meditation are some other really good things. I think one of the hardest things for people when it comes to sleep in modern day is just to kind of shut everything out and allow our bodies to relax. So I put 2 different kind of breathing routines here that I like to do for 10 minutes before bed. The first one is same breath. It's just all nasal breathing, and I'm basically in for a 4 count, exhale for a 4 count, kind of working my way up to 8-10 seconds for 5 or 10 minutes. And then I like to kind of work relaxing breath. But these are 2 things that I like to do for sleep. But I think as you can see here, a lot of this stuff isn't that hard. And I think we tend to think the worst and be like, no. And I think just kind of paying attention to it, starting to track it, and trying some of these things could be a huge game changer for a lot of people. So hopefully it was helpful, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thanks.